welcome to A History of Horror, a video series where we'll be going through the history of horror in only 20 parts. Quite ambitious, I know. Since this is the first part, I want to start with a little introduction, but if you just want to start, immediately with me talking about the movies, you can just skip all of that by going to this time mark. So, the idea is that I picked 100 movies that helped shape the genre to how we all came to know it. Let's get one thing clear though, I'm no film historian like whatsoever. I mean, I'm not even really a film critic. And since I'm doing this whole series, just by myself, obviously it's not gonna be perfect. That's also why I called it A History of Horror and not The History of Horror. I'm simply just a fan, I love cinema in general and I've always had a thing for the horror genre. So it's really just, I'm a little curious to see if I'm able to pull up something like this. So, in short, 20 videos, 5 important, influential, innovative movies per video, and in between those movies I'll try to fill in the gaps. Sounds good? Well, let's do it. So, to explore the roots of the horror genre, we have to go way back to the very beginning of cinema itself. Lyon, that's in France, that's in Europe. It's 1895 when Louis of the Lumière brothers shot what is widely considered the first movie ever. La sortie de l'usine Lumière à Lyon. That's French for, well, I presume, work is leaving the Lumière factory in Lyon. Quite a fitting title. And I know, it's not the oldest surviving film material out there, but this was the first movie shown to a paying audience, so that's why I'm saying it's the first movie. And this is me, some 120 years later, reenacting that movie at the exact same location it was shot. Pretty cool, right? So, after this birth of cinema, it really didn't take long for another French filmmaker, Georges Méliès, one of the very first masters of cinema, the father of special effects, to introduce us to what could be considered the very first horror movie ever. Le Manoir du Diable. Again, this is French, but this time it means the Haunted Castle. Well, this is it. Shot from a one-camera perspective, this 3-minute short tells the wild story of a devil that creates a woman and then sort of messes around with these two soldiers or cavaliers. It's obviously not really scary, probably not even for its time, when it was shown to the public. Before he got into cinema, director Georges Méliès, he was a successful stage magician, and his performances often included bits of comedy. And, well, this he translated to his movies as well. But hey, there's a scary bat, and a skeleton, and what are these, witches or ghouls? Anyway, it's scary stuff. And that's why it's often regarded as the first horror-themed movie. And that's exactly what makes this movie interesting from an historic perspective, but it also shows quite some innovative film techniques. I mean, keep in mind, this was in a time where just editing a movie would be considered revolutionary. And here we see Méliès creating some of the earliest special effects by using the so-called stop trick technique. A technique that might have originated earlier already though, in the super gory Edison-produced The Execution of Mary Stuart. So yeah, cinema's first horror movie. I hope you can sleep tonight. Méliès would go on to direct over 500 movies, most of them shorts, but still. Including perhaps the first science fiction movie, the classic A Trip to the Moon. That's English for La Voyage dans la Lune. Most of these films, however, are now lost after he burned them when his career came to an end and he went bankrupt in the early 1920s. It's a really sad story, actually. This later period in his life is shown in Martin Scorsese's Hugo from 2011. It's a beautiful movie, a Scorsese love letter to early cinema. Check it out while you're at it. So, in the beginning of the 20th century, cinematic language was evolving more and more with movies like The Great Train Robbery, a milestone in editing, and audiences, they sort of lost interest in the funny special effects shows that Méliès was making. For the horror genre, filmmakers started to adapt from literature, like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and for the very first time in 1910, Frankenstein. Which means that we're gonna make a little stop in the US. Yes, we all know Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster in Universal's adaptation, but first there was this version. Produced by the Thomas Edison Studios, responsible for countless productions including the aforementioned Great Train Robbery, Frankenstein tells the story of Dr. Frankenstein, remember kids, Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster, who leaves for college where after 2 years he discovers the mystery of life. Yeah, I might as well just show you these inner titles. I mean, they do a great job at telling the story. You got that? Okay, good. And, well, from here on, the monster just sort of follows Dr. Frankenstein around, who doesn't really want anything to do with him. And then the monster gets jealous when the doctor returns to his sweetheart. Typical. And all of that in some 15 minutes. I've never read the Mary Shelley novel, so I can't really tell how accurate this adaptation is, but it feels very different from the much better known Universal version. Actually, if it wasn't for this one guy, perhaps nobody nowadays would have even known about this version. It was considered lost until the 1970s when this one dude, Alois Detlef? Alois Detlef? I have literally no idea how to pronounce his name. Anyway, when he was like, hey-o, I have a copy here. As a film collector, he bought it like 2 decades earlier, not knowing it was so rare. When he found out though, he did take great care of the copy, you know, making backups on different formats. But at the same time, he was very reluctant to release it to the public, which was kind of a dick move, since literally nobody's seen this movie. Eventually, he did release it, but he added his own watermarks for, I don't know, copyright protection? Even though the movie was and still is in public domain. You know, everybody owns this movie, basically. But that is why, to this day, you'll always see this movie with watermarks. Sometimes blurred or cropped. There's some really shitty versions on YouTube. But in the end, they all come from Detlef's copy. Detlef? Okay, cool. In the decade following the release of Edison's Frankenstein, the US film industry saw a ginormous growth with the birth of, well, Hollywood. And you know, studios like Paramount, the studios that became MGM, and perhaps most notably Universal Studios. But we'll come back to them later. First, back to Europe, where the crazy Germans were making all kinds of weird stuff in their latest artistic movement, Expressionism. Basically where the art comes from within the artist himself. You know, it's usually from a very subjective perspective. You know, a lot of emotions and stuff like that. And while it had already hit the painters and the architects, it wasn't until the early 1920s that the filmmakers started to embrace it, especially within the horror genre. So let's take a look at the quintessential expressionist horror movie. Of course, Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari. The first thing you'll probably ask yourself while watching this movie is, what the hell's going on with the sets? Well, welcome to German Expressionism. Caligari tells the story of, well, Dr. Caligari, who comes to town to perform his show at the fair. His show starring Caesar the Somnambulist, because, you know, that's a thing. Basically just a constant sleepwalker. And, all of a sudden murders take place at the little town. Could there be a connection? Like the previous 2 titles, this one is also often regarded as the first horror movie ever. If anything, it's the first feature-length horror movie that we cover. And it shows murders, you know, scary stuff. But most memorable is probably not so much in the story, but its nightmarish visuals. It's the crooked set designs with shadows painted on them that makes this movie so memorable. And, well, perhaps also its twist ending. Jeez, director Robert Wiene, he pulled an M. Night Shyamalan here, decades before it became cool to even do so. All in all, it's a pretty cool movie. Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari was inspired or influenced by the First World War, or, you know, it can be seen like that. I mean, in retrospect, it's always easy to speculate. But it did definitely inspire and influence movies to come. The whole German Expressionist movement in general did, actually. Most notably the American horror movies. You know, when German filmmakers start to emigrate to the US, like director Paul Laney, who would go on to direct The Cat and the Canary, and cinematographer Karl Freund, who shot the German Expressionist horror movie Der Golem, and who would go on to shoot Universal's Dracula. But before we go there, you know, back to Hollywood, let's stay in Germany for a little bit. So, we've had Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari. I just mentioned Der Golem, or Der Golem, wie in die Welt kam. So, what was that other famous German expressionist horror movie again? Of course, it's Nosferatu. Or in its full original title, Nosferatu, eine Symphonie des Grauens. Directed by legendary German filmmaker Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, Nosferatu is the first movie adapted from Bram Stoker's classic horror novel Dracula, and the first movie produced by Prana Film. as well as their last, since it declared itself bankrupt soon after they were hit with legal issues by Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow. Uh-oh. Yeah, as it turns out, the studio never got the rights to the novel, and well, they figured that if they just make some changes to the source material, it would all be just fine. But that's not how life works. Especially not since it's still quite close to the novel. A real estate solicitor is sent to the castle of Dracula, of Count Orlok, of course, to sell him a house in London, in Wisborg, of course. But soon the guy is sort of locked up in the castle, and Count Orlok will travel back to Wisborg himself, wreaking havoc on the boat and in the town. It does differ from the novel in some aspects, like the absence of the Van Helsing character, and, well, perhaps most notably, the ending, where the vampire isn't killed by a stab to the heart, but by being in direct contact with sunlight, which proved to be highly influential since this wasn't even a big part of the whole vampire folklore before Nosferatu did it. So yeah, the movie is quite slow, but you can't deny that it has some creepy and memorable imagery. For me, Bela Lugosi will always be the original Dracula, but you simply can't deny that Count Orlok is quite iconic as well. It's weird to think that, just like Edison's Frankenstein, we would have almost lost this movie as well. Since, well, following the lawsuit of Florence Stoker, the court ordered all copies of Nosferatu to be destroyed. Fortunately, there were still some copies floating around, and since then we've had a remake by Werner Herzog, a fictional making of by the director of Begotten, of all people, and more recently we saw Count Orlok, or well, at least a reference, pop up in the New Zealand mockumentary What We Do in the Shadows. All in all, I think it's pretty safe to say that this movie earned its spot in cinematic history and, you know, well, in pop culture. So, before we go back to the US to see how all of this influenced Hollywood, let's stay in Europe for a little bit, but, you know, a little bit more up north, to take a look at Häxan, known internationally as witchcraft through the ages. Released the same year as Nosferatu, this Danish-Swedish co-production tells the story of, if you haven't guessed it already, witchcraft. Perhaps not as directly influential as the expressionist movies from Germany, director Benjamin Christensen, he did do something quite different here. Partly based on this old book about witchcraft, he presents his story half documentary, half reenactment, in 7 parts. And it's these fictional reenactments that feature quite some horror elements. I mean, look at all that early torture porn. That, together with some daring nudity, made this movie quite controversial, especially in the US. I mean, hey, cooking babies is always a bit of a touchy subject. The first part is, well, basically just an early PowerPoint presentation about medieval views on stuff like the universe and devils and witches. The reenactments start with the second part, with little stories like a witch making and selling love potions. Why the hell would anybody want to use a love potion on that dude, though? Then, starting with part 3, we follow a witch hunt, including the accusation and, well, I guess the trial of a witch. And then finally, starting in part 6, the director starts to show how silly these old beliefs were. And he draws parallels between accused witches back then and hysteria in present day. Present day as in the early 1920s. And that's it. The end, slut. Memorable for these reenactment scenes, Häxan is a pretty interesting, albeit quite long watch. I watched the original 104-minute version, but there's also a much shorter, jazzier version narrated by William S. Burroughs. At the same time, it can be seen as a pioneering documentary. I mean, it was released the same year as the groundbreaking Nanook of the North, as well as perhaps an early example of an exploitation movie. So, that's Häxan, ladies and gentlemen. And that also brings us to the end of this first part of A History of Horror. In the next part, part 2, we'll be taking a look at the US to see how the recently established Hollywood embraced the horror genre. So yeah, I hope to see you there. Cheers, have a nice day.